Have you ever felt that knowing too much hurts? That lucidity weighs more than ignorance? Prometheus knew, and still he chose to see. In Greek mythology, Prometheus was the titan who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humankind. But that fire was not merely flame. It was consciousness, reason, self-awareness, and for that he was punished. Zeus chained him to a rock, and every day an eagle devoured his liver, only for it to regenerate at night, so that his torment could begin again at dawn. Prometheus did not die, but he never rested. That is the perfect metaphor for the modern human being, aware, awake, and exhausted, capable of understanding their own suffering, yet unable to silence the mind that analyzes it. Prometheus is not a rebel by force, he is a rebel by lucidity, and it is precisely that lucidity that condemns him. Think of the times you've seen too much, when you noticed the falseness behind a smile, felt the emptiness behind a seemingly perfect routine, understood the game the world plays, and still had to keep playing. That is the punishment of Prometheus, the punishment of those who see the fire. Modern psychology would call this hyperconsciousness, the excess of reflection that turns into mental exhaustion, because a mind that cannot rest becomes its own prison. Prometheus knew what he was doing. He knew that bringing light would come with a price, but what he didn't know is that by awakening humankind, he would also condemn it to the pain of endless thought. This myth is a mirror of the contemporary mind, full of light, but without rest, awake but anxious, informed, yet lost. In shadow psychology, Prometheus represents the part of us that wants to understand everything, even what should simply be felt, and in that attempt to control mystery, the soul begins to sicken, the liver devoured. Each day is the symbol of emotional energy drained by constant self-awareness. The organ regenerates, but never heals. So too with the mind that never stops thinking. It restores itself in sleep, but wakes up wounded again. In symbolic language, the eagle that torments him is the gaze of Zeus, the divine law of balance, which punishes every excess. For even knowledge, when unmeasured, becomes hubris, the arrogance of believing one can understand everything. Prometheus teaches us the limit of wisdom, that to know is not the same as to be at peace, and that an illuminated mind, if it cannot rest, becomes its own hell. But there is greatness in his pain. He does not scream, he does not beg, he simply endures, day after day, and that is the essence of the Stoic warrior. Not the one who avoids suffering, but the one who transforms it into purpose. Prometheus is the image of anyone who fights to keep the flame alive, even when the wind cuts the skin. He is the thinker who cannot stop thinking, the caregiver who forgets to care for themselves, the artist who feels too much, the worker who carries the world and still feels guilty for being tired. The fire he brought is the consciousness that saves, but also the one that consumes. And perhaps this is the hardest truth about self-knowledge. Those who awaken can never go back to sleep. In terms of mental health, the myth of Prometheus speaks of limits, of understanding, that carrying the world is not virtue, it's overload, that illuminating everything all the time is not wisdom, it's exhaustion, and that even light needs shadow to exist, because without shadow, light blinds, and without pause, fire turns to ash. Prometheus is the archetype of all of us who confuse consciousness with control, self-knowledge with self-demand, lucidity with punishment. But there is redemption in his silence, not because someone frees him, but because he understands, in the midst of pain, that true freedom is not escaping the rock, but accepting one's own fire. The rock is the body, the eagle is time, and the fire is the soul. As long as there is flame, there will be pain, but there will also be life. There are pains that do not ask permission. They arrive, they settle, they consume, and when the fire comes, it's already too late to run. All that remains is to go through it. Prometheus knew the price of this crossing. He knew that the fire stolen from the gods was not an ordinary flame. It was the symbol of consciousness, the spark of reason, the gift that would make humanity capable of creation, but also of suffering, because once light is lit, there is no longer the innocence of darkness. Zeus punished him for his crime of enlightening mankind. He chained him to a rock, and every day an eagle descended from the heavens to devour his liver, the seat of emotions and life. At night, the organ regenerated, and the torment began again with the dawn, an eternal pain, always new, always the same. But in the silence between one attack and the next, Prometheus understood. It was not just punishment, it was refinement. The rock represented the limits of the body, the eagle, time and the ego devouring what is vital, and the liver, the human soul struggling to survive its own excess. The myth may seem cruel, but it holds deep wisdom. Consciousness, when awakened, hurts. To know too much is to steal fire. It illuminates, but it also burns, and that is the first lesson of self-knowledge. Every light that reveals also destroys what is false. In shadow psychology, Jung said that suffering is the process of the soul's individuation. It is the pressure that turns ignorance into perception. Prometheus is the image of that process. His pain is the birth of a lucid mind. With every bite, he loses a fragment of illusion. With every regeneration, he awakens a little more. Think of the times life broke you without apology, the loss that shattered your ground, the crisis that forced you to change, the silence that made you hear what you had avoided. All of this is the fire of Prometheus working within you. The human soul grows through friction, and suffering is the necessary spark that ignites understanding. Stoicism echoes this ancient truth. It's not what happens to us that harms us, but how we interpret it. Prometheus could not change his pain, but he could change the way he went through it. And that's where he becomes a stoic warrior, not for enduring in silence, but for understanding that silence is the only place where pain becomes wisdom. In symbolic language, the eagle also represents the gaze of Zeus, the divine judgment that sees everything. But psychologically, it is the inner gaze, the relentless self-criticism, the perfectionism that devours us. Prometheus is the mirror of all who punish themselves for feeling too much, of those who believe that suffering means failure. The truth is the opposite. To suffer consciously is to mature. Pain is not the opposite of life. It is the proof that life is happening. And those who learn to suffer with presence, without getting lost in the drama, discover the power of inner fire. Prometheus realizes that his prison is not the chains, but his resistance to transformation. Each day he accepts his pain, and it changes in texture. From burden, it becomes strength. From punishment, initiation, because what binds him is not suffering, it's the fear of feeling. What it has to teach. The fire is not the enemy, it is the teacher. And the punishment is not injustice, it is the oldest path of the soul, the one that forces us to look within when everything outside collapses. How many times have you asked for light and received crisis? How many times have you prayed for clarity and the universe answered with silence? It's always the same. Consciousness never arrives wrapped in comfort. It comes as loss, frustration, emptiness, and when everything seems to fall apart, that is the beginning of reconstruction. Prometheus no longer despairs. He looks at the eagle and understands. It devours me, but it also reveals me. Pain has become a language, and through it, he speaks to the divine. The fire stolen from the gods is no longer a crime. It is an inheritance. Humanity received it, and with it, the responsibility to give meaning to its own suffering. Every time you turn your pain into learning, every time you refuse to let suffering harden you, you honor the sacrifice of Prometheus. He taught us that pain is the price of lucidity, but a lucidity that saves, because it awakens what is most human, the courage to continue. Even when everything burns, fire initiates, and every initiation hurts. But when pain is understood, it becomes the flame that illuminates, and those who cross this fire once are never the same again. The eagle descends every day, relentless, It tears Prometheus's body as though executing a sentence, and the liver regenerates again and again. An endless cycle. There is no pause, no relief, but something hurts more than torn flesh. The awareness that the punishment is also a mirror. Prometheus begins to realize the eagle is not the enemy. It is part of him. It is the ego itself, demanding perfection. Unable to rest, accusing, punishing, devouring, and forcing rebirth each new day. Humanity lives the same scene. It wakes up tired, blames itself for not producing enough, feels guilty for not feeling enough, for not being good enough, beautiful enough, strong enough. The modern eagle has many faces: clocks, goals, mirrors, screens. It feeds on guilt. Prometheus was chained by Zeus, but now the one who keeps the chains tight is himself. The punishment has turned into habit, the torture into routine, and suffering into identity. There is a secret seduction in pain that repeats. It makes us feel alive. The mind learns to confuse intensity with purpose, and so the more it bleeds, the more it believes it is doing what is right. In shadow psychology, this is the cycle of self-demand, the unconscious trying to compensate for a wound of worth. Those who do not feel worthy try to prove their existence through exhaustion. They work too much, love too much, help too much, until they burn out. And when they collapse, the eagle returns whispering, "You've failed." Again, Prometheus then understands that the true prison is not the rock. It is the mind that cannot stop. The unripe ego is an inner predator. It feeds on the need to be perfect, and every time it reaches the summit, it invents a new abyss. How many times have you lived this? The achievement that should have brought relief, but only brought new anxiety. The compliment that lasted minutes before turning into pressure to improve. The success that, instead of freeing you, trapped you in the need to maintain it. That is the eagle within you, the inner gaze that is never satisfied. Stoicism teaches, no man is free who is a slave to his passions. And the most dangerous of passions is the constant need for approval. Prometheus no longer needed to prove anything to the gods, but the ego, disguised as duty, still made him believe he had to keep suffering to deserve the fire he had brought. How many of us do the same? We carry old guilt, punish ourselves for lessons already learned, repeat the punishment in our minds as though it could purify us. But suffering does not purify when it is vanity disguised as virtue. It only wears us down. In psychology, the eagle is also a symbol of higher consciousness, the all-seeing eye, the inner observer. But while it feeds on Prometheus' liver, that gaze is still harsh, still judgment. In time, Prometheus realizes he must change the way he sees. It is not enough to endure pain. He must transform it into understanding. Then, something shifts. He begins to observe the eagle differently. He no longer hates it. He senses that it is hungry for something he has not given it. Acceptance, nothing more. To accept that he was wrong. To accept that he is not a god. To accept that he did what he could. That guilt is not redemption. The liver, the organ of regeneration, represents the human capacity to recover, but to regenerate is not to return to what was. It is to be reborn different. Prometheus begins to grasp this. Each morning the body repairs itself, but the soul is no longer the same. The wound ceases to be punishment and becomes a portal. He discovers that true strength is not resisting the attack, but understanding the reason for the wound. The eagle is the disguised teacher, and the ego, when heard without fear, becomes a guide. Because the ego is not a villain, it is the frightened child trying to stay in control. Prometheus then does the unthinkable. He stops fighting. He offers his body to the eagle with serenity. And for the first time, he feels neither hatred nor fear, only compassion. The pain remains, but the resistance ends, and in the instant it ends, something within him is freed. At that moment, the eagle hesitates. It feels that the flesh has lost the taste of guilt, suffering. Now conscious, no longer feeds anyone. The cycle begins to weaken. Punishment, sustained by hatred, loses energy in the face of acceptance. Prometheus understands what so many still ignore. Pain is eternal only while there is resistance. When we accept what we cannot change, pain turns into presence, and in presence, there is freedom. Perhaps this is the hardest lesson of the Stoic soul. Life does not want us to be flawless gods, but humans who can bear their own humanity. The punishment ends not when the eagle disappears, but when we cease to be prisoners of inner judgment. Prometheus finally learns to forgive himself, and in that moment, for the first time in ages, the sky dawns without the sound of wings. Not all prisons are made of iron. Some are invisible, woven from promises, duties and guilt entangled like threads in a web. Prometheus believed he was bound to the rock by the will of Zeus, but in time, he realized that the chains holding him there were in part his own hands gripping the metal. The divine punishment was only the beginning. The true imprisonment began when he convinced himself that he had to hold up the world alone, to bear the weight of humanity, to be the guardian of fire, the protector of light. And how often do we do the same? We call fear of disappointing others responsibility. We call exhaustion maturity. We take on guilt that isn't ours. We care for everyone except ourselves. Prometheus, the titan of consciousness, became also the martyr of excess. The invisible chains are the hardest to break because they look like virtues, working without rest, always helping, solving everything, but there's a thin line between service and self-erasure, between giving and dissolving. Prometheus crossed that line in silence until duty became identity. In shadow psychology, this is the archetype of the wounded healer, the one who tries to save others to avoid facing their own pain. Prometheus wanted to redeem humankind, but without realizing it, he was trying to redeem himself. He could not bear to see others suffer, because their suffering mirrored his own. It's easy to get lost in that role, to be the one who holds everything together, the rock where others rest, but no one can sustain the weight of the world forever, not even a titan. And when the body gives in, when the mind screams, what we called virtue reveals itself. It was prison. How many times have you felt trapped by something that seems noble? A job, a relationship, a cause that began in love and ended in exhaustion? You believe you're serving the light, but the light has already become a blaze. Prometheus too believed he had to remain chained so that humanity's fire would not go out. But that's the illusion of limitless responsibility. The belief that the world depends solely on our pain. Stoicism reminds us, do what must be done, not what destroys you. Virtue does not demand sacrifice. It demands balance. It's not heroic to die for a cause. It's wise to live to sustain it. Prometheus, exhausted, begins to look at his chains differently. He realizes Zeus no longer needs to tighten them. He does it himself, every day, whenever he insists on carrying what is not his. Each link is a rigid idea of duty. Each knot, an old guilt left unforgiven. He recalls the moment he stole the fire. At the time, he acted out of compassion, but also out of pride. He wanted to prove that mankind deserved the divine gift, and pride, even when disguised as altruism, is a subtle form of imprisonment, because anyone who needs to prove their worth has not yet realized they already have it. Prometheus then begins to do what he never dared, let go, not of the physical chains, but of the inner ones. He lets go of guilt, of the vanity of being the savior, of the belief that suffering is the price of goodness. And with every thought that dissolves, he feels a link fall away. Modern psychology would call this individuation, the process of ceasing to live for others and beginning to live from the self. It's a return to authenticity, a call to become whole without needing to be indispensable. In today's world, these chains are the same, only their names have changed. They are called productivity, reputation, status, perfection. They are the shackles of I have to be strong, I have to handle it, I have to keep going. But when the soul is overburdened, it begins to speak another language, the language of fatigue, irritability, loss of meaning. It is the body saying what the heart could not. Prometheus hears that whisper for the first time. Amid the pain, he feels something different. the kind of tiredness that is not surrender, but clarity. The clarity that says, enough. And that is the first step toward liberation, recognizing that the fire he brought already belongs to mankind, that his mission is complete, that the world does not need his suffering to go on. This is a hard truth to accept because the ego wants to be needed, but the soul wants to be free. At the moment Prometheus accepts this, the chains begin to rust. The sound of metal fades into the wind. He is still bound. Yet the weight is gone, because prison exists only as long as we believe we need it. And then, for the first time, he rests, not from exhaustion, but from wisdom. He understands that caring for others does not mean abandoning himself, that the light he gave to the world only matters if it continues burning within him. Prometheus does not break the chains by force. They crumble on their own the moment he stops believing in them, because the weight of responsibility, once recognized as excessive, ceases to be virtue and becomes choice. There is a moment when the fire stops burning, not because it has lost its strength, but because the one who carries it has learned to walk with it. Prometheus is no longer the arrogant Titan who defied Zeus, nor the chained martyr who endured in silence. Now, he is something different, a being who has understood the nature of fire. The fire that destroys is the same that illuminates. The difference lies in who sustains it. For centuries, he confused light with power. He wanted to give mankind the ability to create, to dominate, to think. But fire is never content to be a tool. It is also a symbol, and only when fire passes from the physical to the inner world does true transformation begin. What he stole from the gods was not merely a flame, it was the gift of consciousness. And with it, the inevitable weight of pain. When humankind received the fire, it began to see itself, and self-seeing is the beginning of all unrest. In his solitude, Prometheus realizes bringing light to others is meaningless. One's own soul remains. Dark, external illumination without inner awarenesses, just reflection on an opaque surface. He understands that the true gift was never to teach man to light the fire, but to teach him to endure its light. In shadow psychology, fire symbolizes vital energy, the creative and destructive impulse within the unconscious. When repressed, it turns into anger, compulsion, into crises that burn from within. But when integrated, that same fire becomes awareness, inspiration, purpose. Prometheus lives the alchemy of the soul. His rock, once a symbol of prison, becomes an altar. There, in stillness, he observes the fire within. He sees that pain and meaning are not opposites. They are two sides of the same flame. Have you ever felt this? That phase of life where everything seems to fall apart, yet there is a quiet clarity in the ashes. When something essential is lost, but something untouchable is born in its place, that is the moment when fire becomes wisdom. Stoicism teaches it is not the fire that purifies gold, but the gold that withstands the fire without losing itself. Prometheus discovers that gold within himself. The flame no longer dominates him, it shapes him. It no longer consumes, it illuminates. He realizes that suffering has a turning point when we stop asking why and begin asking what for. Why seeks blame, what for seeks meaning, and meaning transforms every pain into learning. Prometheus has learned the art of transmutation, to turn wounds into wisdom, solitude into clarity, burden into flame. And through this metamorphosis, he understands that punishment was never vengeance, it was preparation. Modern man lives through the same ritual, he just doesn't recognize it. We call it crisis, burnout, exhaustion, but in essence, it is simply fire-demanding consciousness. The soul burns when it is ready to change, and resisting that is trying to remain whole inside a body that already asks to expand. Prometheus teaches that suffering is destructive only when lived unconsciously, but when faced with open eyes, it becomes embodied wisdom. Each scar turns into a symbol, each loss a space for renewal. He looks to the sky and finally understands. Zeus never wanted to destroy him, he only wanted to remind him that light without humility becomes tyranny. The fire that saves is the same that punishes, and the one who carries it must learn the balance between compassion and limit, between serving and preserving oneself. Prometheus now speaks little. His silence is serene, not bitter. There is dignity in his quietude. He watches humanity, men still lighting fires, still seeking light outside themselves, and he smiles with melancholy, because he knows that true illumination is not in the fire of torches, but in the light within the eyes of those who finally see themselves. In symbolic language, this is the moment when the hero becomes the sage. The outer journey has ended, but the inner one is just beginning, the one who once defied the gods or challenges his own ego, and in doing so, he understands that fire is consciousness, and consciousness is service. He no longer wants to prove anything, he only wants to understand, and those who understand no longer need to win, for the victory of the soul is not conquest, it is belonging to itself. Prometheus. The rebel becomes Prometheus, the master. The fire, once a tool, is now presence. And in the flickering reflection of the flame, he sees not a thief, but a guardian, the guardian of meaning, the protector of consciousness, the symbol of a soul that has learned to turn suffering into wisdom. The fire finally grows calm, and when the flame no longer seeks to burn, it is because it has found its true place, the heart of the awakened. There comes a moment when punishment loses its meaning, when fire ceases to be. Tormentum becomes the light that guides, when the silence of the rock no longer sounds like a prison, but like a temple. Prometheus is different now. His body still bears the scars, but his eyes are free. The eagle no longer descends. The chains still exist, but they no longer bind him. Because true freedom does not begin at the wrists. It begins in the mind that understands. For ages, Prometheus believed his suffering was unjust, that Zeus had punished him for compassion. But now, in the ripening of pain, he realizes the punishment was the path to discovering himself. Each wound brought him closer to what is eternal. Each tear stripped away ego. Vanity, pride, guilt, what remained was only consciousness. In symbolic language, this is the moment of passage, when the hero, after dying 1,000 times, is reborn not into the world, but into himself. Pain fulfilled its purpose. It polished the spirit, dissolved pride, and taught the humility of one who understands that even gods must learn from the fire. Prometheus now understands the flame was never theft. It was an offering. The fire always belonged to humankind, but someone had to be willing to burn for it, and that someone was him, not for glory, but for love. In shadow psychology, this is the stage of total integration, when the unconscious and the conscious recognize each other as one. The being no longer lives in opposition, reason versus emotion, light versus darkness, but in harmony. The shadow is no longer an enemy, it is a source of strength. Suffering is no longer failure, it is remembrance of humanity itself. How many times have you tried to silence something within you because you thought it made you weak? Anger, fear, vulnerability. Yet what we avoid is often what completes us. Prometheus understands this in his own flesh. He stops resisting what he feels, and in that instant, the chain becomes a wing. The fire returns to his chest. But now it is light. It does not weigh, it does not consume. The light is inward, and everything around dissolves into silence. It is the serenity that only comes after the firestorm, the calm that follows when chaos has fulfilled its purpose. Stoicism taught that supreme wisdom is the tranquil acceptance of the order of the universe. Prometheus now sees that order. Nothing was punishment, nothing was accident, everything was learning. Zeus was not an enemy, but a mirror, the part of destiny that forces the soul to grow. And modern man, bound by his own invisible chains, lives the same ritual. Each crisis, each loss, each anguish that feels unbearable is a reminder that there is still fire alive within us, and that fire, however painful, is what makes us human. Prometheus does not return to war, does not seek revenge, does not desire the throne of the gods. He desires silence, the stillness of one who has seen too much and now knows. Truth does not shout. It burns quietly. The fire that once symbolized revolt now symbolizes understanding. Light is no longer a conquest. It is a consequence, and wisdom does not come from what was learned, but from what was lived. He understands that every awakening is a kind of death, and that to die consciously is the beginning of freedom. The Titan, who once screamed, now watches the sunrise in peace. The rock is cold. The chain rests. Nothing needs to be conquered, because everything has been understood. Prometheus is no longer a prisoner. He is the guardian of inner fire, the one who has learned to carry the light without being consumed. And perhaps this is what the myth always meant, that true freedom is not escaping pain, but understanding it until it dissolves. The fire is the same, but the one who holds it has changed. Prometheus looks toward the horizon and sees humanity below, still running among shadows and torches, and for the first time, he feels no urgency to descend. He knows that each being must discover their own fire, live their own punishment, and find their own rock, for it is on the rock that the soul matures. It is in solitude that the spirit learns to be whole. He closes his eyes. There is no more pain, only a gentle warmth in his chest, the memory of all that was learned. And in that memory, the fire returns to the heavens, not as stolen flame, but as a fulfilled promise. Humanity has been ignited, and Prometheus, at last, is free. Here ends another journey. Remember, memento mori. We are all travelers of the shadows, and each conscious step is a flame that lights eternity.